Yo, in this video, I'm gonna walk you through a recent planning rejection that we received in a planning committee, and hopefully it'll help you on your next planning application and how to avoid getting planning rejection. So stick around and subscribe. So last night at 6 p.m, I went to our planning committee for a recent 8-bed HMO that we're trying to get planning permission for. So the scheme itself is a commercial shop and uppers right next door to a metro station. And then the town centre, it's there. Really good, sustainable location, ideal for HMO, great for the council because generally families don't particularly want to live in these kind of houses because it's a huge building, massive for a family home. So it's ideal for apartments or a HMO, sustainable, amenable location. We had full planning support from our planning officers, from the police, from environmental health, etc., etc. Everyone was happy and supported the scheme. However, a councillor rejected the scheme and wanted to speak at committee, so they dragged it into a committee hearing. Now, if you don't know what this means, when you go through a planning application, you put that through to the council and it goes to the planning officers. You compile all your evidence, everything else, you get your surveys done. If you need noise assessments, if you need air quality assessments and all that sort of stuff, you get all that done and it goes through the consultation process with the planning officer. They then go to the Department of Health, they'll go to the police, they'll go to highways, and they'll get all the feedback on the scheme, goes through that consultation process. Literally, this stuff should take weeks, but it takes many, many months. And then they'll decide whether they're in support of the scheme, and they just approve it there and then. If there are no objectors who want to drag it into committee, i.e. councillors or planning officers, or it gets dragged into committee, or it gets outright rejected and they won't support the scheme. So we had full support. The planning officers were in full support. It was a great scheme. And what was interesting with this project, an 8-bed HMO that we're putting forward, there were 3 other HMO applications also in the area before our one that all got rejected, all went through appeal and all lost on appeal. So you would think intuitively, well, it's not looking great for us, is it, on our 8-bed HMO? We didn't know any of this until we were way into the planning process. The planning officer actually said, I'm going to wait for those appeals to come through before pushing their recommendation on our HMO application. All these other 3 HMOs got rejected, but they were tiny. The rooms were like just about meeting space standards, 6-7 square meters, tiny kitchens, and they were converting upper flats with commercial below, converting upper flats into like 7-bed HMOs, like across the high street. Just really like awful offerings. So absolutely they should get rejected. What they should have done is not be so greedy, trying to squeeze in awkward shaped rooms and shared bathrooms without all the right amenities and just about getting by on their space standards. Obviously, no one's going to like the look of that. That is not a good offering. Ours was a stark contrast. We had 14.5 square meter rooms on average. One of them's 20 square meters and the smallest one is 10.5 square meters. These are net internal areas as well. And then the rest of them were between about 14 and 16 square meters. So it's about 14.4 square meters on average per bedroom. That's more than double the minimum space standards. And we had a condition against the planning for it to be a 1-to-1 ratio. So only 1 tenant per room. So only 8 tenants in the property. They've all got 14.5 square meter bedrooms. One of them's got a 20 square meter bedroom and they had a really big kitchen diner. It was about 30 odd square meters. We went really generous on it. There was an existing garage. We'll shell that out, give it a nice skylight. It'll be beautiful, it'll be really nice. And this is why the planning officer didn't take into consideration the rejections on the appeals for the other HMOs, because ours was materially very different offering and very much more sustainable because it's right near the metro, right near the town centre. And all of the officers on the council, the police, environmental health, highways, etc., they all agreed and said, yeah, we're in support of this scheme. But one councillor dragged it into committee because they wanted to talk at committee about their rejection and why they don't support the scheme. A councillor. So when you go to planning committee, it's designed for the local democratic process to have an input on planning applications. And I'm kind of all for it in a way. I'm a bit torn between things. I think there's a lot of legislation, a lot of things that can get abused from both ends of the spectrum. It's a broken system, absolutely a broken system. But I understand that if you live on that street or you live in that area, you want to have a say if the character and the face of the street is going to change significantly. You have a vested interest in that street. You're effectively a stakeholder in that street. So you should have a say. There should be a democratic process. I completely agree. But that is not what we experience. Our planning system is completely broken. It needs to be revolutionized. And here's one of the main problems. So that councillor, you've got the councillors and the planning officers. Planning officers have domain expertise in their given task, whether that's the police, acting on behalf of the police's interests, whether that's highways, acting on behalf of highways interests, and bits and bobs. So these guys are all trained and professionals in their given fields to speak for the scheme. All of them in support. It's in line with the local plan. It's in line with the NPPF guidelines, which are the National Planning Policy Framework guidelines. It helps the diversity of housing in this specific location. It's all good news if this scheme goes goes through. There's no reason why this is going to be a bad impact on the street. It's going to be great. It's a derelict house. No one's using it. The commercial's got no viability. There's loads of dormant commercial little shops on that street because there's no viability for them anymore. They need to be repurposed. There needs to be new housing there, and there needs to be for working professionals, because that is what that specific demographic in that location, as a part of the local master plan, needs. They need that diversification of housing for working professionals, particularly single occupants. So here is the perfect product. You've got all these things. The experts are saying, yes, do it. We as a developer be generous with the design. It's 14.5 square meter bedrooms. These are great sizes in a sustainable location that ticks the MPPF guidelines and the local plan. It's all great. It's all there. We've spent over 100 grand buying the thing, and then up to about 10 grand getting it to this point on all the surveys, the designs, and the extra surveys they asked us to do, our contributions to coastal mitigation, the planning fees, planning consultants, everything else to get it to this point into the planning process where it's got recommended for approval, and then one councillor who's elected by the local people. The planning committee's there to drag these kind of schemes into committee so the local democracy can do its thing and have a say, and it can get passed around the room and we can have questions. But then it goes to a vote where only the councillors can vote. And these are people who don't have any expertise in any given field within this sector, let alone understand HMOs, which they're a bit more of a modern phenomenon in a way. Obviously, people recognize HMOs as bed sits, but the kind of HMOs we do are not. They are like luxury places to live. You'd rather live in our HMO than you would an average apartment. It's way better for you. It's more frugal, cheaper accommodation. It's nicer, more spec, more amenities, less cost on your overheads for utilities, things like that. It's all furnished. You don't have to worry about furnishing the place. It's transient. You can move in 6 months if you want to move in 6 months. This is a different kind of service offering, which these councillors have no idea about. None whatsoever. They just look at things and just think, oh, bed sits, that's like criminals, isn't it? They live in there, and drug addicts. And that is exactly what happened. So we get dragged into committee, which, bear in mind, takes another 2 months of us waiting to get into the next committee hearing. We get into the committee because of one councillor who objected and wanted to speak. We had hardly any objections on this scheme. There was local people really didn't mind. There was no pushback, and we have had big pushback on other schemes in more residential areas. But this was just one councillor with an opinion who dragged it into committee, meaning I then have to go to the committee as well to speak as the applicant. They, as the objector, then speak. So they speak first, then I speak. That councillor that drags it into the committee, for me to then come up there and waste my time, 4 hours round trip going up there, waiting to hear the other cases in the committee, because it's not just one. They go through maybe 10 different cases in that committee hearing. I get there, they didn't even show up to the committee, but by default, it's in the committee now. This is an abuse of the planning system. If you're gonna fucking drag it into committee, you have to speak. And if you can't be bothered to show up, we should just get the approval by default. But instead what happens is it goes into committee, they don't bother showing up, and legally, the constitution of the planning system says I cannot talk as the applicant because they haven't showed up. But bear in mind, if they showed up and I didn't show up, they could talk, which is just stupid. If I bother showing up, I should be able to talk and put my case forward and help educate the councillors on who we are, what our offering is, why we think it's important for the area, etc. Because the planning officer alone can't really do that. They have to be impartial, and they speak with a very boring, candid tone. This is the application, and I think it's good for this reason, and it ticks this box, etc. No opinion, no charisma. What do you guys think? And it's like that, and it's dead. It's awful, and they don't really know a lot about the economics of HMOs and why they're great for housing and things like that. So if I could speak, I could help the councillors, educate them more, progress the councillors, progress the planning system by aiding them with my expertise knowledge in this domain, helping them on other applications that they may see. But no, instead, it is not legal for me to speak if the objector doesn't bother showing up. But still, I'm the one bearing the costs because I'm now in this bloody committee meeting and subject to councillors' subjective opinions with no expertise in this given field. And then what happens? So I have to sit there, be quiet. I'm just sat in the stand. I've just got to wait and hope for the best. But sadly, what happened is our planning officer presented the case. She did a very average job of doing it. Again, just so boring, like just, there's no passion, nothing like that. These rooms are like, this is where charisma goes to die. There's one guy. None of them really had anything to say. A couple of them asked a couple points about parking, but this one guy is a young kid. He's like early 20s. He sat there, clearly, you can just tell, anyone can tell when a young kid is trying to impress his peers and impress the older people in the room. He just wanted to go through everything, picking at different things, but he had no idea what HMO was. He just assumed, well, there's lots of people living in a building, so isn't that gonna be bad for crime? Am I wrong in that? But the way he delivered it was, so Chair, I've actually got 6 different points. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but I just want to go for these 6 points. In section 4.235 and on page 7, it delineates that so on that basis, I just don't think it's a good environment for these sort of tenants to live in. I think it's going to be bad on the local population. My next point is on section 325. I don't think the cordial relationship between the tenants will be adhered to if there's 8 people sharing a kitchen. And he just kept banging on, and he'd sit back and kind of do that. And I'm like, this guy's ego is just exploding in the room, a young kid, he clearly just wants to hear the sound of his own voice. And then you got the councillors next to him, their egos are getting fired up and they want to start saying stuff. He's gaslighting them and then they start talking about stuff. Nothing logical. Because bear in mind, one of the biggest points they spoke about for about 10, 15 minutes, and I've been through this so many fucking times in planning committees and it's just a nightmare because you can't say anything. And one of them goes, so 8 occupants, I know that we've got this restriction for 1-to-1 ratio, so only one person can live in each room, but doesn't mean they couldn't like have a friend round. So they could have a friend come round. And what if all 8 of them have friends around on the same day? That could be 16 people. And what if all 16 of them have cars? That's 16 cars that could be on that street. And there's not 16 car parking spaces. So I think there's going to be a big issue with car parking. And it's just like, you have no idea. Not only do these tenants want frugality, and not only do they not particularly want people to come to their HMO to celebrate and have a good evening. That rarely happens, particularly in our HMOs. These are people who just want to knuckle down, work, contribute to the local economy, save some money so they can go and get another place. They're a service, a temporary service for a year, couple years, for someone to be able to get on their feet, save some money, have a useful place to live, and then move on and then get an apartment, get a house because they can afford it because now they've stayed in frugal accommodation. HMOs are a critical part of our society. We need them and we need high quality HMOs, particularly in these specific areas and amenable locations. They rarely have cars, and the census data actually shows that it's something like 1 in 7, 1 in 10, if that, on the car ratios for HMO tenants. The chair moves it to the highways officer, says, what do you have to say about that? And he says, well, as the planning officer explained at the start of this pitch, there are permits on this street. There's double yellow lines on the whole front of the street. There's only 3 permits per property, which would be the same if it was an apartment or if it was a HMO, it doesn't really matter. There's only 3 permits, and the census data doesn't support that each tenant would have a car. So it's a pretty null and void point. That's the highways officer. The highways officer is saying that. Councillors go, no, I understand, but they could still go and park on like other streets and other areas and congest other parts of the town. And it's just like, how far do you go with that? They might park at their own gaff in the next town over and walk over. It's just so stupid. It's just so stupid that could even be raised as a point. If the highways officer's there and says, no, this isn't an issue, like we don't need to talk about this, the councillor should then just shut up and just go, yeah, sweet. And it shouldn't be something they can vote against. And instead, the other one, an elderly lady, who had nothing to say before, when it went out for questions, she had nothing to say. Because of this gaslighting kid, she went, yeah, I understand what you're saying, highways, but there's nothing to stop loads of friends coming over, so there could be 16 cars there. And that could be really bad for the local people that live there. It kind of keeps going around like that on multiple different bullshit points. And then this same little fucking kid, I shouldn't be disparaging, but it's very annoying that I've got hundreds of thousands of pounds on the line. There is an economy that we need to look after, and it all comes down to these bottlenecks where kids with no experience, no knowledge, can exploit the planning process in this sort of way and collude with other councillors, which they do as well. These councillors they're locals, they live in those wards and things like that, and they will collude to make sure that if there's an application they don't like, well, they'll all be sort of biased and against it when it comes to the committee meeting. I've seen it happen, there's been reports of it happening. It happens, because they all get in a car together and they go around and visit the sites before the committee days, and in that time, they can talk about whatever they want. They could conspire against the scheme. It all pisses me off. There's nowhere near enough control on this process to safeguard not only developers parting ways with risk capital, but also local people who need this kind of housing, who need work to happen. We were going to spend £180,000 in that building. It's £180,000 going into that local economy on construction, materials, lads on site, working at the local shops and going to buy their local butties and getting a pint of beer afterwards and all this kind of stuff. And then the 8 people at the end who are going to live there, and then us being able to refinance that capital, go buy another one and do it again and keep helping society and the economy propagate. Because we're doing the right thing and it's in our planning application. The other planning applications that got refused, they're not doing the right thing. They were trying to exploit housing. They're trying to create really tiny rooms, crappy places for people to live. It's obvious. Ours is obvious. They're very generous room sizes. They're double the minimum space standard. Everyone in that committee, even the councillors, agreed, yeah, they're really good sized rooms. This is a really good offering compared to the others. But the last point that stuck them up, health and safety. Health and safety. I just don't think it's a safe building. 8 people in one building. And this is that kid again. Sorry, Chair, I've got another point. If you go to the other page, clause 6.52.329, health and safety is what concerns me about this one. And you can see it in the police report as well. Now, the police report was for the other properties where they said, yeah, we think health and safety wise, it's going to aid in more crime and more poor housing and a congregation of bad people because it's just not a good tenant offering. You're going to attract the wrong sort of characters. And I completely agree. But he tried to relate that to our scheme and said, the police have said that about this scheme. And it's like, and literally the planning officer then went, yeah, but they've not said that about this scheme. But that's about another scheme. That's a different thing. This one is fine. The police didn't have anything to say about it. What's the problem? The guy goes, yeah, but just because the police didn't have anything to say about it, I still think 8 people living in one building, that's a lot of people in one building. And it's a massive building. Like, these are big rooms, big building. There's no problem with 8 people living there. And this is standard. There's loads of 8-bed HMOs out there. And he just assumes that because 8 people live in there, they're likely to be criminals and they're likely to cause damage to local property, loads of noise and things like that. And it's like, well, there's 2 shops next door, so they create noise anyway. There's a main road there and a fucking train track. So he's going on about all these points he's got no idea about, and then claiming health and safety to the people within the HMO and the effects on the people around the HMO, trying to say that it's going to cause more crime, which is condescending. It's not just condescending, it is discriminatory towards people who need to live in this kind of accommodation because they're trying to save on costs. And they're all working professionals. None of our tenants are DSS. They are all working professionals. They all contribute to the local economy. And we have to take on a lot of risk capital and a lot of risks putting through these schemes. Here's an example of that risk gone wrong. We have to wait 9 months through an appeal to wait to get our planning, and we've got capital tied up. That's a risk we take on as developers. For anyone out there who thinks developers are greedy people, we take on all the fucking risk. And there's a lot of developers and contractors that go bust all the time because they don't necessarily know what they're doing, or they get stuck in these pitfalls with councils and bollocks and people like that. Now, it's an unencumbered asset. We've got some holding costs like standing utility charges, things like that, which again are all going to cost us money. It's all wasted capital. Could be spent on actually tenants living in there, but we can't because this one kid. To be fair to the councillors, there was 2 other councillors sat on the end, would raise their hand, and when they speak, they'd say, just to let you know, I think there's a lot of nonsense being spoken about up here. I am fully in support of this application. I think it's a good scheme. I think it's a good idea, and I don't see a reason why there's going to be a problem with parking. I think that's creating an extreme scenario that's very unlikely to happen. And health and safety wise, well, who's to assume that all these people are going to be criminals? I lived in a HMO when I was a student, etc. I don't think it's a problem. So I am in full support of this planning application. And his mate next to him said yes. So I'm not saying councillors are bad. There are councillors who know what they're doing. They understand. They have common sense. And 4 of them were for it. 4 of them sort of kept shaking their heads at the other ones. But this kid in a fucking Adidas top and shorts with like scruffy trainers on is just banging on about all this shit and riling up the 2 next to her. And then when it went to the vote, the chair just changed his tune last minute and went, on the points of health and safety, which I understand, I am going to recommend that this scheme gets rejected. And I was really surprised to hear it come out of his mouth because all the planning officers are in full support and rebuttaling against the councillors. What should have happened is it was clear that the planning officers were in full support of the scheme. They only had good responses to some of the councillors' objections, which were created out of naivety and a misunderstanding of how HMOs actually work. And then 4 of them were in support of the scheme. And the chair should be there impartially to sort of understand what's going on, be able to look at the scheme on a meritocratic basis and go, what is the most common sense thing here? So I was really surprised when he just turned around and went, so I'm going to recommend it for refusal. I was like, what? From what? Because he mentioned about health and safety, because they might cause more crime. I'm just like, what? That's mental. And then they voted, and because his vote plus the rest of the council then made 6 against 4. So 4 were in support of us, 6 were against, including the chair. So then we lost and it got rejected, which means they now have to go through an appeal process. An appeal is absolutely bullshit. You have to get an independent inspectorate that comes from Bristol. They assess the scheme, its material grounds. They're not looking at it subjectively at all. They just look at the planning policies, the local plan, things like that. Is the scheme viable? What are the committee notes? And the committee notes will show 4 were for it and 6 were against it, including the chair. It's pretty close to a tie. Literally, if just one of them came to our side, it's 5 on 5. So it's pretty close. The scheme stands out as being, double space standards, amenable location within the city boundary, right next to the metro, right there. Planning officers in full support. I think I'm going to approve this scheme. That is what is very likely to happen. But annoyingly, it's going to take 9 months. That is how long it takes appeals to happen, which just seems so stupid because that's 9 months that building sat there derelict, doing nothing. Fuck all we can do about it. Yes, we could look at, trying to do some other quirky scheme, and we would. We've looked at a few different options, but I'm very confident we're going to get this 8-bed through. So it just sits there and it waits, and that is bullshit. But that is an in-depth experience in my most recent planning committee meeting, and I've had loads of them. I've had rejections before. I've had stuff go to appeal and we've won it. I've had stuff go to appeal and we've lost it, and there's always bullshit things that happen. But the important takeaways for you listening to this are, number 1, make sure that you're not only meeting the local plan, so understand the local plan, which is where a planning consultant can be great. They can see the local plan and how it fits in with the NPPF guidelines, which are the National Planning Policy Framework, and make sure that if you're putting a HMO there, that it is in line with the local plan. Like, does the local plan want and need that diversification of housing stock? Are you in an amenable location? Are you near local shops? Are you near a metro? Are you near a bus stop? Things like that. Are you near the town centre? Because that is going to be more likely that those tenants are going to get the right fulfillment out of that accommodation in that location. It's going to attract the right kind of people. So we ticked all of these boxes, by the way, and we still didn't get it. So it's not a guarantee, but we will win on the appeal because of these things. So it's important to understand that. Sometimes there's areas in the UK where planners, they just refuse everything. So you only can go to appeal. So it's all about preparing for appeal. And HMOs nowadays, particularly sui generis HMOs, I think you just need to start preparing for appeal. Prepare that you're going to go to appeal. In which case you want to make sure that you not only fit the local plan and that you're pretty bulletproof on that standpoint, but also that your offering is substantial. Your offering is really good. So we had 14.5 square meter bedrooms. We could have got a 10-bed HMO out of that property. We could have got a 9-bed quite easily as well, obviously, but instead we went for an 8-bed. 7-bed, there would have been a wasted space. 8-bed was just a perfect, optimal amount to have large bedrooms, all en suites with a big kitchen diner. We proposed a dormer as well, which the planning officer did mention and liked, because the dormer creates more headspace in that loft, allowing for 2 bedrooms. You don't have to do the dormer to meet space standards, but again, it's about offering that bit more. We had a rear extension as well to extend the kitchen out a little bit from the garage. So we created all these things to show that this is going to be clearly a better product than others on the market. So you want to make sure you position the actual design and the proposition of the building in the right way, and make sure it fits in with the local plan. And ideally, you have a planning consultant who can work with you on that application on sui generis HMOs, so that you're tying all of this in nicely into a planning statement when it then goes to the planning officer for the application. And throughout that process, if the planning officer has specific recommendations that are pretty clear, that if you don't give them a little bit, that they're not going to then recommend it for approval, well then see what you can do. How can you compromise? How can you give them something they want? And in this case, the one thing we gave them was a 1-to-1 ratio, a condition against the planning application to state that we can only have 1 tenant per room. And that is now case law. That is now happened in multiple cases, which didn't happen just a couple of years ago. There wasn't much evidence of that, so planning officers didn't really know what to do. Usually they would say, this is a planning matter and this is a licensing matter. When it comes to occupation, that's the licensing department. We don't talk about that in planning committees. But councillors never fucking listened, and councillors kept talking about how many people live in the room, so they needed to come up with some way of doing it, and a 1-to-1 ratio can be conditioned against the planning decision notice, and you have to follow that. So there's all these kind of things you can do to position the HMO in the best way, so that if you get rejected by the councillors, who, bear in mind, you will struggle to win over, they don't care about you. A lot of them kind of hold us with contempt because they think we're greedy developers making loads of money off their local communities, and they hear it from neighbours and local people all the time. And bear in mind, if you're building on any street, all those people think you're public enemy number 1, because everyone wants the country to prosper. Everyone wants us to grow and build and make sure we meet our housing demands, just as long as you don't build on my street. That's the general consensus of most people, which is unfortunate, and it's why the local democratic system for planning is broken. It doesn't work. It needs to be completely rethought and redone, and I have actually had some good ideas on how this could be done, but that's for another video. Anyway, hopefully that's been some useful nuggets on sui generis HMOs, planning committees, and lots of headaches. Wish me luck on our appeal. Big love, subscribe, see you in the next one.